of the trucks lining up the streets, closing down traffic, the argument about who was doing what, anti-vax, etc. You talked to some of the people that were involved in this. Is the fire still there for them? Are they still ready to do what they need to do to get their message across, or is it just kind of dimmed a little bit?
It really depends on who you talk to. So people who are in Hamilton, downtown Hamilton on Sundays will know there is a small group of about a dozen or so protesters who have been there for about 130 consecutive Sundays. They were protesting before the so-called Freedom Convoy to Ottawa, and they're protesting now, and they haven't stopped. And as you mentioned at the top, there is a plan to have what I could best describe as a convoy jamboree on a religious camp about 30 minutes outside of Winnipeg. On the other hand, there are some pretty prominent voices within what is a largely leaderless movement who are saying protests are no longer necessary in large measure because the mandates that were ostensibly supposed to be at the core of what they were protesting last year, those have been lifted for a long time. So they don't think that protests do anything except make them look bad. The fire in the belly for many of them, no matter which side of that divide they're on, still seems to be there. The issue is they can't decide anymore on what they should be protesting. What they're protesting now is a sort of a buckshot of different issues and how and when they ought to be doing that. But for some people, protesting has now become a near permanent way of life, and this is just what they do. They do it in person, and they do it on social media, sometimes every day, sometimes all day, every day.
But as you mentioned in the piece that I was reading, Grant, and I think we talked about this last February as this was going on in Ottawa, and even as the convoy was making its way across the country, there's a huge variety of reasons why people were there or why people supported it, even if they weren't there. Some were anti-vaxxers, some didn't like the mandates, so that's certainly clear. Some were just people that just didn't like government and don't like rules and regulations, and they latched onto that issue as kind of a focus for their angst and their anger.
That's very true. I mean, one of the people we spoke to for that story was a guy named Justin Long, who had, you may remember the old Yellow Vest movement from around 2019. Yeah. This was like a proto-convoy movement. It was the first attempt by a bunch of anti-government people to sort of organize a movement to just oppose the federal government. And he was one of those. And he's got a tattoo on his hand that on the top of his hand that commemorates both the Ottawa occupation and the Yellow Vest movement that he used to be part of. So you're right. There's a very powerful anti-government sentiment. Generally, there's people who were doing this before the pandemic even began. And there's also sort of a quasi-QAnon element to all of this. I mean, you look at the things that they're protesting now, which were issues that these people had before Ottawa, but they were galvanized in that one moment around the mandate. But we have people protesting the LGBTQ community and drag shows. We have people protesting what they think is a government's attempted takeover of the internet. We have people protesting the WEF. We have people protesting all kinds of different. Jordan Peterson, is another one. So it's depending on who you talk to in the movement, it may give you a different answer on what it is that they think is their top issue to protest now.
And I'm glad you brought up the insurrectionists in the States, of course, the January 6th event from a couple of years ago, too, because it seemed to be the same formula, really, when you look at it. The Proud Boys and a number of other groups who basically were just, they were anti-establishment, anti-media, anti-government types. And all of a sudden they focused on what they considered to be a corrupt election. There was no evidence of that, but that was their focus, and that kind of brought all these desperate groups together. And the same thing seems to be happening here. But and they always, and as you point out in the article, you talk to a number of these people, and even if you go back to some of the testimony of some of the ones who have been tried on charges, they talked about the bouncy castles and the barbecues, and we were just there protesting, and we were peaceful. But you counteract that with people like Tom Marazzo, who you talked about, a former Army guy who was one of the leaders of the insurrection too. and he's still basically preaching about anarchy, about, you know, the public should be able to overthrow the government if they so fit. No elections necessary. We'll just decide who's going to govern and what they're going to do. That's the polar opposite of bouncy castles, isn't it?
It sure is, and you know, it's worth noting that philosophically, the convoy movement and the people behind the January 6th insurrection in the U.S. I mean, they're very close. I mean, they often will retweet the same things, the same memes, whether it's about Joe Biden or vaccines. Like they're singing from the same very big hymnal of conspiracy theories in that case. The difference in Ottawa, of course, it was not an attempted insurrection, although it was 3 weeks of occupation plus the border crossings, which were shut down, all of which resulted in the invocation of the Emergencies Act. But yes, you do have a different kind of kettle of fish with some of the louder voices, including Tom Marazzo, including Preston Manning, we should note, the former Reform Party leader and leader of the official opposition in Ottawa a few years back. Manning and Marazzo are singing from the same book when it comes to creating, they want to see the creation of some kind of citizens committee that has some sort of oversight over the House of Commons. Marazzo, even the other day, is, you know, trying to sort out some way that you could depose the government without an election. If the government's unpopular in his view, you should just be able to remove it somehow. On top of that, you have Preston Manning now pushing for what he's calling a citizens' inquiry into the federal government's COVID-19 response. But this is not an official inquiry being done under the auspices of the Public Inquiry Act. They can't compel testimony. There's no rules of perjury and jurisprudence, all of which you would normally have in an inquiry. Instead, the commissioners and the witnesses and the rules are being decided by some sort of working group that Preston Manning, when I interviewed him, declined to identify. So, you know, it's not even an official inquiry. It does seem to have a predetermined idea that everything that had happened in the response was wrong. Excuse me. And on top of it all, the rules of it are being decided by people that aren't being identified. And we know that some of the people that are with the small kind of group of directors that Manning is working with have deep connections to some of the louder voices, both in the convoy group in the United States and the insurrectionists in the U.S., including Paul Alexander, who was a former advisor to former President Trump.
Fascinating article, and I think it gives us a really deep perspective on what has happened and what could be happening in the future. Grant, congratulations, great work on this, and thanks for spending some time with us today. Really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, Bill. Anytime.
Take care. Grant Lafleche, investigative journalist. His piece is in the Hamilton Spectator. This is the Bill Kelly Show, CFPL London, CHML Hamilton.